Have you ever noticed how certain women possess an almost magnetic pull that has nothing to do with their appearance or what they say? They move through the world with a quieter presence, speaking less but somehow commanding more attention. Men find themselves drawn to these women in ways they can't quite explain, captivated by something that exists in the spaces between words, in the pauses between thoughts. This isn't about shyness or timidity. This is about a profound psychological phenomenon that Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, understood deeply. There's something about the silent woman that awakens something primal in the masculine psyche, something that goes far beyond surface attraction into the very depths of what it means to be human. What we're exploring today isn't just about relationships or dating advice. This is about understanding a fundamental truth that most people completely miss. While the world celebrates noise, demands constant communication, and rewards those who fill every silence with words, there exists a different kind of power. A power that operates in stillness, that commands through presence rather than proclamation. Jung would say that what draws men to silent women isn't weakness or passivity. It's the recognition of something they've lost in themselves, something that modern society has systematically stripped away from both men and women, leaving us all desperately seeking what we can no longer name. But here's what makes this truly fascinating. The silent woman isn't just withholding speech. She's cultivating something far more valuable. She's creating space for the unconscious to speak, for mystery to flourish, for depth to emerge. And in a world that has forgotten the value of contemplation, that depth becomes irresistible. Think about it for a moment. When was the last time you encountered someone who could sit in complete silence without the compulsive need to fill that space with noise? Someone who could listen not just to your words, but to what you weren't saying. Someone whose very presence seemed to invite you into a deeper conversation with yourself. This is the power we're going to unpack today. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of profound presence. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of fullness. Because what Jung discovered about the human psyche reveals why men are drawn to this quality in ways that bypass rational thought and speak directly to the soul. The modern world has conditioned us to believe that communication means constant talking, that connection requires endless chatter, that love expresses itself through a flood of words and explanations. But Jung understood something that our culture has forgotten. The most profound communications happen in silence. The deepest connections form in the spaces where words cannot reach. When a man encounters a woman who has mastered this art of meaningful silence, he's not just meeting another person. He's encountering a mirror that reflects back to him everything he's been seeking but couldn't articulate. She becomes a gateway to parts of himself he's forgotten existed, aspects of his own psyche that have been buried under layers of social conditioning and masculine performance. This woman doesn't need to chase or pursue. She doesn't need to prove her worth through endless conversation or constant availability. Her silence isn't a strategy or a game. It's the natural expression of someone who has learned to communicate with the deeper currents of life itself. And men sense this authenticity at a level that transcends conscious awareness. Jung called this phenomenon the encounter with the anima, the feminine aspect of the masculine psyche. When a man meets a woman who embodies this quality of conscious silence, he's actually encountering a projection of his own inner feminine. She represents everything he's been taught to suppress or ignore about himself. The intuitive, the receptive, the contemplative aspects of his own nature that society told him were weakness. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The silent woman isn't silent because she has nothing to say. She's silent because she understands the profound power of timing, of presence, of allowing space for truth to emerge naturally. She speaks when her words carry weight, when they serve a purpose beyond filling awkward pauses or seeking validation. This selectivity in communication creates what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. When someone speaks rarely but meaningfully, their words carry exponentially more impact. Men find themselves hanging on every sentence, analyzing every pause, seeking deeper meaning in every gesture. The scarcity of her verbal expression makes each word feel like a gift rather than an obligation. There's something almost mystical about this dynamic. In a culture obsessed with transparency and constant sharing, the woman who maintains her inner sanctuary becomes a living mystery. She doesn't reveal everything at once. She doesn't explain her every thought or justify her every action. This creates a natural tension, a gravitational pull that draws men into orbit around her quiet strength. Jung would argue that this attraction stems from something even deeper than romantic or sexual desire. It touches on the fundamental human longing for wholeness, for integration of the shadow aspects of our personality that we've learned to reject. The silent woman represents a return to something essential that modern life has trained us to abandon. Consider how most interactions unfold in our hyper-connected world. Conversations become competitions for attention. People interrupt each other, waiting for their turn to speak rather than truly listening. Everyone performs their personality rather than simply being present. The constant noise of modern communication creates a kind of psychic exhaustion that we're barely conscious of experiencing. Into this chaos steps the woman who has learned the art of conscious silence. She doesn't compete for airtime. She doesn't perform her intelligence or worth through verbal gymnastics. She simply exists with such presence that her silence becomes more compelling than most people's words. Men encounter this and feel something they haven't experienced in years. The relief of not having to perform, the peace of being truly seen rather than constantly evaluated. This isn't about women becoming passive or submissive. This is about the cultivation of a different kind of power entirely. The power that comes from depth rather than volume, from presence rather than performance, from being rather than doing. It's the power that exists in the eye of the storm, the stillness at the center of chaos. Jung understood that the psyche naturally seeks balance. In a world that has become increasingly extroverted, increasingly focused on external validation and constant expression, the introverted qualities of reflection, contemplation, and meaningful silence become not just attractive, but necessary for psychological health. The silent woman represents this missing piece, this essential counterbalance to the frantic energy of modern existence. But what exactly constitutes this kind of silence? It's not the absence of opinion or the suppression of personality. It's not about becoming a blank canvas for others to project upon. True conscious silence comes from a place of fullness, not emptiness. It emerges from someone who has done the inner work of understanding themselves so deeply that they no longer need constant external validation or expression to feel whole. This woman has learned to distinguish between speaking from ego and speaking from essence. She recognizes the difference between words that serve connection and words that merely fill space. Her silence isn't a withholding, but a gift, creating room for deeper truths to emerge in conversation, allowing others to discover aspects of themselves they might never encounter in the constant chatter of typical social interaction. Men recognize this quality immediately, even if they can't consciously articulate what they're experiencing. They sense that they're in the presence of someone who operates from a different frequency entirely. Someone who has access to depths that most people never explore, who carries wisdom that can only be cultivated in solitude and reflection. This recognition triggers something profound in the masculine psyche. It awakens a desire not just for romantic connection, but for spiritual communion, for the kind of deep understanding that transcends words and touches the very core of being. The silent woman becomes a gateway to experiences that men have been unconsciously seeking their entire lives. In our next exploration, we'll dive deeper into the psychological mechanisms that make this dynamic so powerful, examining how Jung's theories about the collective unconscious and archetypal patterns explain why this attraction feels so universal and timeless. We'll uncover the specific qualities that distinguish conscious silence from mere quietness, and reveal how this understanding can transform not just romantic relationships, but our entire approach to human connection. The journey we're beginning touches on some of the most fundamental questions about human nature, consciousness, and the mysterious forces that draw us together. Because understanding why men crave silent women is really about understanding what we're all secretly seeking in our relationships with others and with ourselves. The psychological architecture of this attraction runs deeper than most people realize. What men are responding to in the silent woman isn't just her quietness, but the profound sense of self-possession that emanates from someone who has learned to exist without constant external input. She has cultivated what Jung called an inner dialogue with the unconscious, a relationship with the deeper parts of herself that most people never acknowledge exist. This internal completeness manifests in ways that bypass rational understanding and speak directly to something ancient in the masculine psyche. When a man encounters a woman who doesn't need his words to feel validated, who doesn't require his attention to feel worthy, who doesn't seek his approval to feel complete, he experiences something revolutionary. He meets someone who exists independently of his projection, someone who cannot be easily categorized or controlled through the usual social mechanisms. The silent woman operates from what Jung identified as the transcendent function, the psychological process that bridges conscious and unconscious content. She has learned to listen not just to the surface chatter of daily life, but to the deeper currents that flow beneath ordinary awareness. This connection to her own depths creates an almost gravitational field around her, drawing others into contact with parts of themselves they've forgotten or never knew existed. But here's where the dynamic becomes truly fascinating from a psychological perspective. The masculine psyche is naturally drawn to what Jung called the mysterium, the unknown territory that promises transformation and growth. In a culture that has systematized and explained away most mystery, the woman who maintains connection to her own inner depths represents a return to the sacred unknown, the fertile darkness from which new consciousness emerges. This isn't about playing games or manipulating through withholding. The authentic, silent woman has moved beyond such strategies because she has discovered something far more valuable than external validation. She has found the source of fulfillment within herself, and from that fullness she relates to others not from need, but from choice, not from lack, but from overflow. Men sense this authenticity immediately because it contrasts so sharply with the performative quality of most social interaction. They recognize that they're encountering someone who isn't trying to impress them, isn't competing for their attention, isn't performing a version of femininity designed to elicit a specific response. This absence of agenda creates space for genuine connection to emerge, the kind of meeting between souls that transcends the usual dance of ego and manipulation. The psychological impact of this encounter cannot be overstated. Most men have become accustomed to relationships where they must constantly interpret, decode, and respond to endless streams of communication. They've learned to navigate emotional landscapes filled with hidden meanings, unspoken expectations, and complex negotiations around feelings and needs. The silent woman offers something entirely different: the relief of authentic presence without the exhausting demand for constant emotional labor. This doesn't mean she's emotionally unavailable or disconnected. Quite the opposite. Her emotional life runs so deep that she doesn't need to constantly externalize it for validation or processing. She has learned to hold her feelings with the same kind of conscious awareness that she brings to her thoughts, integrating both into a coherent sense of self that doesn't require constant external maintenance. Jung would argue that what men are really seeking in the silent woman is a reflection of their own potential for inner integration. She represents the possibility of wholeness that exists when someone has done the difficult work of reconciling their conscious personality with their unconscious depths. This integration creates a kind of psychic magnetism that operates below the threshold of ordinary awareness, but profoundly influences how others respond to her presence. The quality of attention that the silent woman brings to interaction is fundamentally different from the scattered, performance-oriented awareness that characterizes most social exchange. When she listens with her entire being, creating a field of receptive presence that allows others to discover aspects of themselves they've never articulated. Men experience this quality of attention as something precious and rare, a gift they've been unconsciously seeking their entire lives. This depth of presence emerges from what contemplative traditions have long recognized as the cultivation of inner stillness. The silent woman has learned to quiet the constant mental commentary that drowns out subtler forms of awareness. In that quietude, she has discovered access to intuitive wisdom, to the kind of knowing that emerges from direct experience rather than conceptual understanding. Men recognize this wisdom immediately, even if they can't consciously identify what they're perceiving. They sense that they're in the presence of someone who has access to information that bypasses the usual channels of rational analysis. Her responses emerge from a deeper source, carrying the authority of lived truth rather than borrowed concepts or socially programmed reactions. This connection to inner wisdom manifests in countless subtle ways that create profound psychological impact. The silent woman doesn't feel compelled to fill every pause with commentary. She can sit with discomfort without immediately rushing to resolve it. She can witness strong emotions without being overwhelmed by them, or needing to immediately fix or change them. This capacity for presence in the face of intensity creates a sense of safety that men rarely experience in their relationships. The psychological relief of being with someone who doesn't need constant reassurance, who doesn't require endless explanation of thoughts and feelings, who doesn't demand continuous emotional processing, cannot be understated. Most men have learned to navigate relationships that feel like ongoing therapy sessions, where every interaction becomes an opportunity for analysis and improvement. The silent woman offers something different, the possibility of simply being together without the exhausting work of constant relationship maintenance. But this doesn't mean she's passive or disengaged. Her silence is active, conscious, purposeful. She chooses when to speak and when to remain quiet based on what serves the deepest truth of the moment. Her words, when they come, carry the weight of careful consideration, emerging from reflection rather than reaction, from wisdom rather than impulse. This selectivity creates what psychologists recognize as heightened significance around her communication. When someone speaks rarely but meaningfully, their words naturally carry more impact. Men find themselves paying closer attention to her subtle expressions, reading deeper meaning into her gestures, seeking understanding in the spaces between her words. The scarcity of her verbal expression makes each communication feel significant rather than routine. Jung understood that the psyche naturally seeks what it lacks. In a culture that has become obsessed with constant expression, continuous sharing, and transparent communication, the qualities of reflection, contemplation, and meaningful silence become not just attractive but psychologically necessary. The silent woman represents these missing elements, offering balance to the frantic extroversion that characterizes modern life. This balancing function operates at both individual and collective levels. For the individual man, encounter with conscious feminine silence provides own-negal access to dissected capacity for introspection and depth. For the culture as a whole, women who embody these qualities serve as living reminders of what we've collectively abandoned in our rush toward constant connectivity and expression. The attraction men feel toward the silent woman is really an attraction toward wholeness itself, toward the possibility of integration that exists when someone has learned to honor both their active and receptive natures, their expressive and contemplative aspects, their doing and being modes of existence. She represents the resolution of contradictions that most people experience as perpetual internal conflict. This integration doesn't happen overnight or by accident. The silent woman has undertaken what Jung called the hero's journey into her own unconscious depths, confronting the shadow aspects of her personality that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. She has faced the parts of herself that are uncomfortable, unacceptable, or inconsistent with her conscious self-image. And through this confrontation, she has achieved a kind of psychological sovereignty that radiates outward in everything she does. Men unconsciously recognize this inner work because it reflects their own unlived potential. Most have learned to operate from a narrow band of their full psychological spectrum, expressing only those aspects of themselves that society deems acceptable for masculine identity. The silent woman represents the possibility of wholeness they've abandoned, the integration of all aspects of self that creates genuine authenticity rather than performed personality. This recognition triggers what Jung identified as the transcendent function in the masculine psyche. The encounter with her integrated presence activates dormant aspects of his own personality, particularly those qualities associated with the anima, the feminine aspect of his unconscious. Suddenly he finds himself accessing parts of his own nature that have been buried under layers of social conditioning about what it means to be a man. The psychological impact of this activation cannot be understated. Men often report feeling more creative, more intuitive, more emotionally nuanced when in the presence of a truly silent woman. It's as if her integrated consciousness gives them permission to explore territories within themselves they've been taught to ignore or suppress. Her wholeness becomes a mirror reflecting back their own potential for completeness. But this dynamic also explains why such women can be simultaneously attractive and threatening to the masculine psyche. The very qualities that draw men toward her also challenge the fragmented way they've learned to exist in the world. Her integrated presence exposes the poverty of relationships based on projection, performance, and mutual need fulfillment, rather than authentic meeting between whole human beings. The silent woman has learned what Jung called the art of conscious relationship with the unconscious. She doesn't fear the depths of her own psyche because she has developed the capacity to navigate those depths with awareness rather than being overwhelmed by them. This fearlessness in the face of inner complexity creates a kind of psychological fearlessness that extends to all areas of her life. Men sense this fearlessness immediately and find it both attractive and intimidating. Here is someone who cannot be easily manipulated through emotional drama because she has faced her own emotional depths and learned to relate to them consciously. She cannot be controlled through withdrawal of approval because she has found the source of approval within herself. She cannot be possessed through creating dependency because she has cultivated genuine independence. This psychological freedom manifests in countless subtle ways that create profound impact on masculine consciousness. She doesn't need constant reassurance about the relationship because she exists independently of it. She doesn't require endless processing of every interaction because she has learned to integrate experience directly rather than needing to externalize it for validation. She doesn't demand continuous proof of love because she loves herself with sufficient depth that external love becomes enhancement rather than necessity. The relief men experience in the presence of this kind of emotional maturity is profound. Most have learned to navigate relationships that feel like ongoing negotiations, where every interaction becomes an opportunity for misunderstanding, where constant vigilance is required to avoid triggering emotional reactions they don't understand. The silent woman offers something entirely different, the possibility of relaxation into authentic being, rather than exhausting performance of relationship skills. This relaxation allows access to what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness that represents our full potential as human beings. In the presence of someone who has achieved a degree of integration, men often report feeling more themselves than they have in years. The artificial constraints of masculine performance begin to dissolve, replaced by access to the full spectrum of human experience they've been taught to reject or suppress. But the silent woman's power extends beyond individual psychological impact. She represents what Jung identified as a cultural archetype, a pattern of being that emerges when civilizations have become too extroverted, too focused on external achievement, too disconnected from the deeper sources of meaning and wisdom. Her presence serves a collective function, reminding society of qualities and capacities it has forgotten or abandoned. In traditional cultures, this archetype was often embodied by priestesses, wise women, or contemplatives, who served as bridges between the ordinary world and deeper realms of meaning. Modern society has largely eliminated these roles, but the psychological need they served hasn't disappeared. The silent woman unconsciously fulfills this function, serving as a living reminder of depths that exist beyond the surface concerns that dominate contemporary consciousness. This archetypal dimension explains why the attraction men feel towards such women often carries a spiritual or mystical quality that transcends ordinary romantic desire. They sense that they're encountering something sacred, something that connects them to layers of meaning they've forgotten existed. Her silence isn't empty, but full of possibility, pregnant with potential insights and experiences that can only emerge in the spaciousness she creates. The cultivation of this quality isn't about becoming passive or withdrawn. True conscious silence emerges from fullness rather than emptiness, from strength rather than weakness, from choice rather than fear. The woman who has developed this capacity has learned to distinguish between speaking from ego and speaking from essence, between communication that serves connection and communication that merely fills space or seeks attention. This discernment creates what Jung called differentiated consciousness, the ability to respond rather than react, to choose rather than be driven by unconscious compulsions. Men recognize this quality immediately because it contrasts so sharply with the reactive patterns that characterize most social interaction. They sense that they're encountering someone who operates from awareness rather than automation, from presence rather than performance. The psychological sophistication required to maintain this kind of conscious silence cannot be understated. It requires the development of what contemplative traditions call witness consciousness, the capacity to observe one's own thoughts, emotions, and reactions without being identified with or controlled by them. This inner observer creates space between stimulus and response, allowing for conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. Men unconsciously recognize this inner space because they long for it themselves. Most have learned to live in a state of constant reactivity, responding immediately to every external stimulus without pause for reflection or conscious choice. The silent woman's capacity to inhabit that space between stimulus and response offers them a glimpse of psychological freedom they've never experienced, but somehow recognize as their birthright. This recognition triggers what depth psychologists call the awakening of dormant potentials. In her presence, men often discover capacities within themselves they didn't know existed. The space she creates through her conscious silence allows them to hear their own inner voice, often for the first time in years. Her refusal to fill every moment with words creates opportunity for their own deeper thoughts and feelings to emerge into consciousness. The transformational impact of this dynamic extends far beyond romantic relationships. Men who encounter this quality of conscious feminine presence often report fundamental shifts in how they relate to themselves, their work, their friendships, and their understanding of what it means to live an authentic life. The silent woman becomes a catalyst for their own journey toward wholeness, toward integration of the aspects of themselves they've learned to reject or ignore. Jung understood that such encounters are not accidental, but represent the psyche's natural movement toward balance and completeness. The attraction men feel toward conscious feminine silence is really the call of their own unlived potential, their own capacity for depth and integration that has been buried under layers of social conditioning about masculine identity and performance. This understanding reveals why the dynamic feels so universal and timeless. It's not about contemporary dating strategies or modern relationship dynamics. It touches on fundamental patterns of human consciousness that have existed throughout history. Archetypal configurations that represent the psyche's natural movement toward wholeness and integration. The woman who has developed this quality of conscious silence has undertaken what amounts to a spiritual discipline, cultivating inner capacities that allow her to exist independently of external validation, while remaining fully engaged with life. Her silence isn't withdrawal, but deeper engagement, not absence, but profound presence, not emptiness, but fullness that doesn't need to constantly prove itself through expression. This profound presence creates what Jung called a constellation in the collective unconscious, activating dormant potentials, not just in individuals who encounter her, but in the larger cultural field. Her very existence serves as a reminder of possibilities that have been forgotten, capacities that have been abandoned, ways of being that could transform how we understand relationship, communication, and human connection itself. The profound magnetism of the silent woman operates through what Jung identified as the principle of psychological compensation in a world that has become increasingly dominated by what he called the extroverted attitude, where value is measured by output, expression, and constant doing. The psyche naturally seeks its opposite. The woman who embodies conscious silence represents this compensatory function, serving as a living embodiment of the introverted values that modern culture has systematically devalued. This compensation isn't merely personal, but archetypal. Jung understood that certain individuals unconsciously carry qualities that the collective psyche needs for balance. The silent woman serves this function, representing depth in a culture obsessed with surfaces, contemplation in a world addicted to action, being in a society that only recognizes doing. Her very existence challenges the fundamental assumptions about what it means to be valuable, worthy, or significant. Men respond to this challenge at a visceral level because it awakens something in them that has been dormant, perhaps for decades. The modern masculine identity has been constructed around performance, achievement, and constant external validation. The encounter with a woman who operates from an entirely different paradigm creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, a psychological tension that demands resolution. But this dissonance isn't uncomfortable in the way most psychological tension feels. Instead, it carries the quality of recognition, the sense of encountering something that feels both foreign and deeply familiar. It's as if men are remembering something they never consciously learned, accessing a way of being that predates their social conditioning but feels more authentic than anything they've experienced in adult life. The silent woman's power lies not in what she withholds, but in what she has discovered within herself. She has learned to access what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that bridges conscious and unconscious content. Through this bridge, she has gained access to forms of knowledge that bypass rational analysis and speak directly to deeper layers of understanding. This inner knowing manifests in countless subtle ways that create profound psychological impact. She doesn't need to analyze every situation to understand it, because she has developed what ancient traditions call direct perception. Her responses emerge from this deeper knowing, rather than from calculated strategies or learned behaviors. Men sense this authenticity immediately because it contrasts so sharply with the performative quality of most social interaction. The psychological relief of encountering someone who operates from this kind of inner authority cannot be overstated. Most men have become accustomed to relationships that feel like ongoing negotiations, where every interaction requires careful calculation to avoid triggering reactions they don't understand. The silent woman operates from such inner stability that she doesn't need these elaborate defensive mechanisms. Her responses emerge from depth rather than reactivity, from presence rather than protection. This stability creates what attachment theorists call a secure base, a psychological safe haven where others can relax their defensive postures and access more vulnerable aspects of themselves. In her presence, men often discover that they can speak truths they've never articulated, explore feelings they've never acknowledged, access creativity they didn't know they possessed. But the silent woman's influence extends beyond creating safety for emotional expression. Her very presence seems to awaken what Jung called the creative unconscious, the source of innovation and inspiration that operates below the threshold of ordinary awareness. Men often report feeling more creative, more intuitive, more connected to their own deeper purposes when in relationship with such a woman. This activation of creative potential happens because conscious silence creates space for what contemplative traditions call the still small voice, the subtle guidance that emerges when the mind becomes quiet enough to perceive it. The silent woman has learned to hear this voice in herself, and her presence seems to attune others to the same frequency within themselves. The psychological mechanism behind this attunement involves what neuroscientists call neural synchronization. When we're in the presence of someone who operates from a state of inner calm and coherence, our own nervous systems naturally begin to entrain to that rhythm. The silent woman's inner stillness becomes contagious, creating a field of calm that allows others to access states of consciousness they rarely experience in ordinary social interaction. This neurological synchronization explains why men often report feeling more centered, more present, more themselves when in the company of a truly silent woman. It's not just psychological, but physiological. Her presence literally changes their brain state, allowing access to capacities that are normally suppressed by the stress and reactivity of everyday social interaction. Jung would argue that this synchronization serves an even deeper function. It represents the psyche's natural movement toward individuation, the process by which we become fully ourselves rather than collections of social roles and expectations. The silent woman has advanced further along this path of individuation, and her presence serves as a catalyst for the same process in others. This catalytic function explains why relationships with such women often feel transformative rather than merely romantic. Men sense that they're not just encountering a potential partner, but a guide toward aspects of themselves they've never explored. Her silence isn't empty space but fertile ground where new aspects of personality can emerge and develop. The quality of attention that the silent woman brings to relationship operates at levels that most people never access. She has learned to listen not just to words, but to the spaces between words, not just to what is said, but to what cannot be said, not just to conscious communication, but to the unconscious currents that flow beneath all interaction. This depth of listening creates what phenomenologists call presence, a quality of being fully here and now that allows genuine meeting to occur between two human beings. In a culture that has forgotten how to be present, this quality becomes precious beyond measure. Men recognize it immediately as something they've been seeking their entire lives without knowing how to name it. The psychological impact of being truly heard at this level cannot be understated. Most people go through their entire lives feeling fundamentally unseen and unheard, speaking words that seem to bounce off the surface of others' awareness without ever reaching the depths where real understanding lives. The silent woman's capacity for deep listening creates the possibility of being known at levels that transcend ordinary social exchange. This quality of being known touches on what Jung identified as one of the deepest human needs, the need to be witnessed in our full complexity rather than reduced to simple categories or expectations. The silent woman doesn't try to understand others through analysis or interpretation, but through a kind of direct perception that sees beyond personality to essence. Men experience this quality of seeing as both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling because they finally feel recognized in their full humanity, rather than just their social roles or achievements. Terrifying because this recognition exposes the gap between who they really are and who they've been pretending to be, sometimes for decades. This exposure of authentic self often triggers what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a period of psychological crisis where old identities dissolve and new ones struggle to emerge. The silent woman's presence can precipitate this crisis because her authenticity makes the pretense of everyday social interaction feel unbearable. But this crisis, though difficult, serves an essential function in the process of individuation. It represents the death of false selves that have outlived their usefulness and the birth of more authentic ways of being. The silent woman serves as both witness and midwife to this process, holding space for the transformation without trying to control or direct it. Her capacity to hold space for such profound transformation emerges from her own journey through similar territories. She has faced the dissolution of her own false identities, encountered the terror and exhilaration of not knowing who she is beyond her social roles, and emerged from that darkness with a deeper connection to her essential self. This personal experience of death and rebirth gives her the psychological capacity to support others through similar passages. She doesn't fear the chaos and uncertainty that accompany authentic transformation because she has navigated those territories herself. Her silence often carries this quality of fearless presence in the face of psychological uncertainty. Men sense this fearlessness at an unconscious level and find it both attractive and intimidating. Here is someone who has faced the fundamental questions of existence and emerged not with easy answers, but with the capacity to live comfortably with mystery and uncertainty. This comfort with the unknown represents a kind of psychological maturity that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The attraction to this quality reflects what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural movement toward wholeness that often requires embracing paradox and uncertainty rather than seeking simple solutions. The silent woman embodies this transcendent function, representing the possibility of living authentically without needing to have everything figured out or under control. This embodiment of comfortable uncertainty creates what existential psychologists call authentic presence, a way of being in the world that doesn't depend on external validation or fixed identity, but emerges from direct engagement with the mystery of existence itself. Men recognize this quality as something they've been unconsciously seeking, a way of being that feels more real than anything they've experienced in their carefully constructed adult lives. The psychological sophistication required to maintain this kind of authentic presence, while remaining genuinely open to others, represents what Jung called the achievement of the transcendent attitude. This attitude transcends the usual dichotomies of strong versus weak, active versus passive, masculine versus feminine, creating a third way that includes and transcends these oppositions. The silent woman has learned to inhabit this transcendent space, operating from a place that is simultaneously receptive and strong, contemplative and engaged, mysterious and present. This integration of apparent opposites creates a kind of psychological magnetism that operates beyond the usual categories of attraction and speaks to the deepest levels of human longing for wholeness. Men respond to this integration because it reflects their own unlived potential for transcending the narrow definitions of masculinity they've been taught to embody. In her presence, they glimpse the possibility of being fully human rather than just masculine, fully present rather than just successful, fully themselves rather than just their achievements and roles. This glimpse of fuller humanity often triggers what depth psychologists call the call to adventure, the inner summons to embark on the hero's journey toward their own individuation. The silent woman becomes the herald of this call, not through what she says, but through what she represents. The possibility of living from essence rather than ego, from depth rather than surface, from authentic being rather than performed identity. The transformational power of this encounter extends far beyond romantic relationship into every area of life. Men who have experienced genuine meeting with conscious feminine silence often report fundamental shifts in their relationship to work, creativity, friendship, and their understanding of what it means to live a meaningful life. These shifts occur because the encounter activates what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness that represents our full potential as human beings. The silent woman's integrated presence serves as a mirror reflecting this potential, awakening dormant capacities and calling forth aspects of personality that have been buried under layers of social conditioning. The activation of the self creates what alchemists called the philosopher's stone, the capacity to transform base experiences into gold, to find meaning and value in whatever circumstances arise. The silent woman has developed this capacity within herself, and her presence tends to awaken it in others. This alchemical function explains why relationships with such women often feel sacred rather than merely romantic. They touch on the deepest levels of human potential and transformation, serving not just personal fulfillment, but the larger purpose of conscious evolution. The silent woman becomes a catalyst for the kind of individual transformation that ultimately serves the transformation of culture itself. Jung understood that individual consciousness and collective consciousness are intimately connected. As individuals achieve greater integration and authenticity, they contribute to the collective possibility for the same qualities to emerge on a larger scale. The silent woman serves this collective function, representing possibilities that could transform how society understands relationship, communication, and human connection. Her very existence challenges the dominant cultural narratives about what it means to be valuable as a woman and what it means to be in relationship with feminine energy. She demonstrates that power doesn't require loudness, that influence doesn't require manipulation, that love doesn't require possession or control. These demonstrations of alternative ways of being create what social psychologists call cognitive alternatives, new possibilities that expand the collective imagination about what kinds of relationships and ways of being are possible. The silent woman serves as a living proof of concept for ways of relating that most people have never experienced, but somehow recognize as more authentic than conventional approaches. This recognition triggers what Jung called the prospective function of the psyche, the unconscious awareness of future possibilities that pulls us forward toward greater wholeness and integration. Men sense in the silent woman not just who she is, but who they could become through relationship with the qualities she embodies. This prospective pull explains why the attraction often feels destined or fated, rather than merely chosen. It touches on what Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggest deeper patterns of connection operating beyond the realm of ordinary causation. The encounter with the silent woman often feels like such a synchronicity, a meaningful collision with exactly what is needed for the next stage of psychological development. The depth of this attraction reflects the magnitude of what is at stake. The silent woman represents not just romantic possibility, but evolutionary possibility, the chance to transcend the limitations of conventional relationship and access forms of connection that serve both individual growth and collective transformation. Men unconsciously sense this larger significance and respond not just with romantic desire, but with what could be called evolutionary urgency. The deep knowing that such encounters are rare and precious opportunities for fundamental transformation that shouldn't be wasted or taken lightly. This urgency explains why the attraction to truly silent women often feels more intense and significant than ordinary romantic attraction. It carries the weight of unlived potential, the promise of accessing aspects of human experience that have been forgotten or suppressed, but never truly lost. The psychological territory we're exploring touches on the deepest mysteries of human consciousness and connection. The silent woman serves as both map and guide to territories within ourselves that most people never explore, offering not just relationship, but initiation into the full spectrum of human possibility that lies dormant within each of us, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The psychological mechanics of this attraction operate through what Jung called the law of opposites. In a culture that has become addicted to noise, to constant stimulation, to the relentless chatter of digital communication, the silent woman represents something that has been systematically eliminated from modern experience. She is not the opposite of communication, but its deepest form. Not the absence of expression, but expression so refined that it transcends the need for constant verbal validation. This refinement creates what depth psychologists recognize as psychic density, where most people scatter their energy across endless conversations, explanations, and social performances. The silent woman has learned to concentrate her presence into something far more potent. Every gesture carries weight. Every word, when it comes, lands with the impact of truth rather than the superficial bounce of social pleasantries. Men encounter this density and feel something they haven't experienced since childhood. The relief of being in the presence of someone who doesn't need them to be anything other than what they are. No performance required, no constant entertainment necessary, no elaborate emotional labor to maintain the relationship. Just the profound simplicity of being witnessed without judgment or demand. But this witnessing isn't passive. The silent woman has developed what contemplative traditions call active receptivity, the capacity to receive another person so completely that they begin to discover aspects of themselves they never knew existed. Her attention becomes a mirror that reflects not just surface personality, but essence. Not just what someone says, but who they are beneath the words. This quality of attention activates what neuroscientists have identified as the default mode network in the brain, the neural system that comes online when external stimulation decreases and inner awareness expands. In her presence, men often report accessing states of consciousness they haven't experienced since before they learned to perform masculinity for social approval. These altered states aren't mystical experiences, but returns to natural ways of being that have been suppressed by the demands of modern life. The constant need to produce, to achieve, to prove worth through external accomplishments creates a kind of psychological armor that becomes so familiar we forget we're wearing it. The silent woman's presence creates conditions where that armor becomes unnecessary and begins to dissolve. This dissolution reveals what Jung called the pure eternus, the eternal youth that exists beneath the hardened shell of adult responsibility and social expectation. Not childishness, but the childlike capacity for wonder, creativity, and authentic response that gets buried under layers of conditioning about what it means to be a successful adult man. The emergence of this authentic self often feels like falling in love. But it's really falling in love with aspects of themselves they've forgotten existed. The silent woman becomes a catalyst for this remembering, not through what she does, but through what she allows. Her silence creates space for their own inner voice to emerge from beneath the constant noise of social expectation and performance. This inner voice, when it finally surfaces, often carries messages that challenge everything they've been taught about success, relationship, and what it means to live a meaningful life. The silent woman doesn't judge these revelations or try to direct them toward any particular outcome. She simply holds space for whatever truth wants to emerge, trusting in the wisdom of the psyche's natural movement toward wholeness. This trust in natural unfolding represents something revolutionary in a culture obsessed with control, management, and manipulation of outcomes. The silent woman has learned what Taoists call Wu Wei, the art of effortless action that emerges from alignment with deeper currents rather than force of will. Her relationships unfold according to this principle, developing organically rather than according to predetermined agendas or timelines. Men experience this organic unfolding as profoundly liberating because it frees them from the exhausting work of trying to manage another person's emotions, expectations, and needs. They discover what it feels like to be in relationship with someone who takes responsibility for her own inner state, rather than making it their job to maintain her emotional equilibrium. This emotional self-sufficiency doesn't create distance, but intimacy of a quality most people have never experienced. When someone doesn't need you to complete them, they can choose to be with you from a place of genuine desire rather than unconscious dependency. This choice creates what attachment theorists call secure bonding, the kind of connection that enhances rather than diminishes individual autonomy. The psychological sophistication required to maintain this balance between intimacy and independence represents what Jung called the achievement of psychological maturity. The silent woman has learned to love without losing herself, to connect without merging, to remain open without becoming vulnerable to manipulation or control. This maturity manifests in countless subtle ways that create profound impact on masculine consciousness. She doesn't create drama to test love or loyalty. She doesn't manufacture crises to generate attention or emotional intensity. She doesn't use withdrawal or silence as weapons to punish or control. Her silence emerges from fullness rather than strategy, from presence rather than absence. Men recognize this authenticity immediately because it contrasts so sharply with the psychological games that characterize most romantic relationships. They sense that they're encountering someone who has moved beyond the adolescent patterns of emotional manipulation that keep most people trapped in cycles of conflict and reconciliation that never lead to genuine resolution or growth. The absence of these manipulative patterns creates space for what Jung called the transcendent function to operate in relationship. Instead of the usual dance of projection and counter-projection, genuine meeting becomes possible. Instead of using each other to avoid uncomfortable truths about themselves, they can support each other's journey toward greater authenticity and wholeness. This support doesn't come through advice or analysis, but through the quality of presence the silent woman brings to whatever arises. She has learned to be with difficulty without immediately trying to fix it, to witness pain without being overwhelmed by it, to hold space for transformation without trying to direct or control the process. This capacity to be present with whatever emerges creates what trauma therapists call a healing environment, a psychological space where old wounds can finally surface and resolve. Many men carry emotional injuries from childhood or previous relationships that have never been properly witnessed or integrated. The silent woman's presence often creates the first safe space they've ever encountered, where these buried experiences can finally be processed and released. The healing that occurs in these spaces isn't dramatic or cathartic, but gentle and organic, like the natural healing that occurs when physical wounds are kept clean and undisturbed. Her silence doesn't probe or push, but simply creates conditions where the psyche's natural healing mechanisms can operate without interference. This natural healing often reveals capacities that have been buried under layers of emotional armor and defensive patterns. Men discover that they have access to intuition they didn't know existed, creativity that was suppressed by practical concerns, emotional sensitivity that was trained out of them by cultural conditioning about masculine identity. The emergence of these buried capacities feels like coming alive after years of existing in a kind of psychological hibernation. Colors seem brighter, experiences more vivid, life more meaningful. This isn't romantic idealization, but the natural result of accessing fuller ranges of human capacity that have been dormant for years or decades. The silent woman serves as both witness and catalyst for this awakening, but she doesn't take credit for it or try to control its direction. She understands that each person's journey toward wholeness is unique and cannot be directed from the outside. Her role is to create conditions where that journey can unfold naturally, rather than trying to determine its destination or timeline. This respect for others' autonomy, while remaining fully engaged with their process, represents what Jung called the transcendent attitude. It transcends the usual dichotomies of involvement versus detachment, caring versus indifference, support versus independence. The silent woman has learned to care deeply while holding lightly, to support without enabling, to love without possessing. This transcendent approach to relationship creates what systems theorists call emergent properties, qualities that arise from the interaction between two whole systems, rather than the attempt of one incomplete system to use another for completion. The relationship itself becomes a third entity with its own wisdom and evolutionary trajectory. Men experience this emergence as something sacred, a connection to forces larger than their individual egos or personal desires. The relationship becomes a vehicle for touching what Jung called the numinous, the sense of contact with something divine or transcendent that gives meaning to existence beyond personal gratification or achievement. This contact with the numinous through relationship represents what many spiritual traditions consider the highest possibility of human connection. The silent woman has learned to create conditions where such contact becomes not just possible, but natural, emerging from the depth of presence she brings to every interaction. Her silence isn't empty, waiting, but active creation of sacred space where the deepest truths can emerge and be witnessed. This space becomes a temple where the ordinary activities of relationship are transformed into opportunities for mutual recognition of the divine spark that exists within each person. Men sense this sacred quality immediately and respond not just with romantic desire, but with what could be called spiritual hunger, the deep longing to connect with something larger than themselves that gives meaning to their existence beyond material success or social recognition. This spiritual dimension of attraction explains why relationships with truly silent women often feel like coming home to something they never knew they were missing. It's not just personal compatibility, but recognition of their own spiritual nature reflected in someone who has learned to live from that deeper source. The silent woman has made the journey from personality to essence, from ego to self, from individual identity to what mystics call cosmic consciousness. Her presence serves as a reminder that such transformation is possible, and as a guide for others who feel called to undertake similar journeys. This guidance doesn't come through teaching or instruction, but through modeling what it looks like to live from essence rather than ego. Her silence demonstrates the peace that comes from no longer needing to prove anything to anyone. Her presence shows the power that emerges when someone stops seeking validation from external sources and finds the source of all validation within themselves. Men recognize this inner authority immediately because they long for it themselves. Most have spent their entire adult lives seeking approval, recognition, and validation from others, never realizing that the source of all these things exists within their own consciousness. The silent woman has found that source and learned to draw from it, making her independent of the emotional marketplace where most relationships operate. This independence creates what economists call non-zero-sum dynamics. Instead of competing for limited resources of attention, approval, or validation, both people can draw from unlimited inner sources, creating abundance rather than scarcity in the relationship. This abundance allows for generosity of spirit that transforms every interaction into an opportunity for mutual enrichment rather than negotiation over emotional resources. The psychological freedom that emerges from this abundance cannot be overstated. When neither person needs the other for completion, they can meet as whole beings rather than complementary halves. This wholeness creates the foundation for what Jung called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage between masculine and feminine principles that represents the ultimate goal of psychological development. This sacred marriage doesn't require literal romantic relationship, but can occur within individual consciousness when the masculine and feminine aspects of the psyche achieve integration and balance. The silent woman has achieved this integration within herself, making her a living symbol of the possibility that exists within every human being. Men respond to this symbol with what Jung called archetypal recognition, the immediate knowing that they are in the presence of something that represents their own deepest potential. This recognition bypasses rational analysis and speaks directly to the unconscious, creating attraction that feels both mysterious and inevitable. The inevitability of this attraction reflects what depth psychologists call the constellation of archetypal patterns. When certain conditions are met, archetypal energies automatically activate, creating experiences that feel larger than individual choice or personal preference. The encounter between a man and a truly silent woman often carries this quality of archetypal inevitability. This inevitability doesn't negate free will, but reveals the deeper currents that influence human behavior and attraction. We are drawn to what we need for our own development, and the silent woman represents qualities that are essential for masculine psychological development in our historical moment. The specific qualities she embodies, depth over surface, presence over performance, being over doing, represent exactly what is needed to balance the extreme extroversion that characterizes contemporary masculine identity. Her silence calls forth the introverted capacities that men have been taught to suppress or ignore. This call to introversion isn't a call to withdrawal from life, but to engagement from a deeper place. The silent woman demonstrates that true power comes not from external action, but from internal alignment. Not from force, but from presence. Not from having all the answers, but from being comfortable with mystery and uncertainty. Men sense this deeper source of power and recognize it as something they've been seeking their entire lives without knowing how to name it. The attraction they feel is really attraction to their own unlived potential, their own capacity for depth and integration that has been waiting for the right conditions to emerge into consciousness and expression. The psychological territory we're exploring reveals something that most people never consciously recognize, but feel at the deepest levels of their being. When a man encounters a woman who has mastered the art of conscious silence, he's not just meeting someone attractive, he's encountering what Jung would call a living symbol of the individuated feminine, someone who has completed the psychological work that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. This completion doesn't mean perfection or the absence of growth. It means she has faced what Jung called the shadow, those aspects of herself that were unacceptable to her conscious mind, and has integrated them into a coherent whole. She has descended into her own psychological underworld and returned with treasures that most people never discover exist. The integration of shadow material creates what depth psychologists recognize as authentic presence. There's nothing hidden that needs to be managed, nothing suppressed that threatens to erupt unexpectedly, nothing denied that creates internal conflict. This wholeness radiates outward in ways that bypass conscious perception and speak directly to the unconscious mind of others. Men sense this integration immediately because their own shadow material resonates with her completeness. They recognize, without being able to articulate it, that they're in the presence of someone who has done work they haven't yet attempted. This recognition creates what Jung called the transcendent function, a psychological bridge between conscious and unconscious content that facilitates growth and transformation. But the shadow integration that creates her silence isn't just personal, it's archetypal. She has faced not just her individual psychological material, but the collective shadow of feminine conditioning that has been passed down through generations. She has confronted the cultural messages that told her she needed to be constantly available, endlessly accommodating, perpetually seeking approval through pleasing others. This confrontation with collective conditioning requires what Jung called heroic consciousness, the courage to stand against the pressure of social expectation and cultural programming. The silent woman has undertaken this heroic journey, not through dramatic external adventures, but through the quiet courage of refusing to abandon herself for the comfort of others. This refusal to self-abandon creates what could be called psychological sovereignty, an inner authority that doesn't depend on external validation or approval. She has found the source of her worth within herself and learned to draw from that inexhaustible well rather than seeking drops of validation from the shallow pools of social interaction. Men recognize this sovereignty as something they've been unconsciously seeking their entire lives. Most have learned to define themselves through achievement, through the opinions of others, through their ability to provide or perform or succeed according to external metrics. The encounter with someone who has found her worth elsewhere triggers what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, a psychological tension that demands resolution. But this dissonance carries the seeds of transformation. It reveals the poverty of external validation systems and points toward the possibility of finding what they've been seeking in all the wrong places. The silent woman becomes a living demonstration that there is another way to exist in the world, another source of security and self-worth that doesn't depend on the fickle approval of others. This demonstration often triggers what Jung called the call to individuation, the inner summons to undertake the psychological work necessary to become fully oneself, rather than a collection of social roles and expectations. The silent woman serves as herald of this call, not through what she says, but through what she represents. The possibility of psychological freedom. The freedom she embodies isn't freedom from responsibility or commitment, but freedom from the compulsive patterns that keep most people trapped in cycles of seeking, achieving, and disappointment. She has learned to want from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, to choose from awareness rather than compulsion, to love from overflow rather than need. This quality of loving from overflow creates what attachment theorists call secure base behavior. She doesn't need constant reassurance about the relationship, because she doesn't derive her sense of security from external sources. She doesn't create drama to test loyalty, because she doesn't doubt her own worth. She doesn't manipulate through emotional withdrawal, because she has no need to control others' responses to feel safe. Men experience this security as profoundly calming to their nervous systems. Most have learned to navigate relationships that feel like emotional minefields, where any word or action might trigger reactions they don't understand and can't predict. The silent woman's emotional stability creates a field of safety where they can finally relax their hypervigilance and access more authentic aspects of themselves. This relaxation allows what Jung called the natural self to emerge from beneath the layers of defensive adaptation that characterize most adult personality. Men often discover to their amazement that they have access to sensitivity they thought they'd lost, creativity they didn't know existed, emotional depth they'd been taught to suppress. The emergence of these buried capacities feels like remembering something essential about themselves that got lost along the way. The silent woman's presence serves as a catalyst for this remembering, creating conditions where natural psychological healing can occur without forced processing or analytical interpretation. This healing happens through what trauma specialists call co-regulation, the nervous system phenomenon where one person's calm presence helps regulate another's agitated state. The silent woman's inner stillness becomes contagious, creating physiological changes in those around her that allow access to states of consciousness normally suppressed by stress and social anxiety. These altered states aren't temporary highs, but returns to natural ways of being that have been buried under years of cultural conditioning. Men often report feeling more like themselves in her presence than they have in decades, accessing ways of perceiving and responding that feel both foreign and deeply familiar. This familiarity reflects what Jung called archetypal memory, the unconscious knowing of patterns and possibilities that exist within human nature, regardless of individual experience. The silent woman activates these archetypal memories, awakening dormant capacities that exist as potential within every human psyche. The activation of archetypal potential creates what depth psychologists recognize as numinous experience, encounters with the sacred that give meaning to existence beyond personal gratification or material success. Men often report that relationships with truly silent women carry this quality of the sacred, touching dimensions of experience they didn't know existed. This sacred dimension emerges because the silent woman has learned to relate to others from what mystics call essence rather than personality. She sees past the social masks and defensive adaptations to the eternal spark that exists within every human being. This quality of seeing transforms ordinary interaction into something approaching communion. Men experience this depth of seeing as both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling because they finally feel recognized in their full humanity, rather than just their social roles. Terrifying because this recognition reveals the gap between who they really are and who they've been pretending to be. Sometimes for so long they've forgotten the pretense was temporary. This revelation of authentic self often precipitates what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a period of psychological crisis where old identities dissolve and new ones struggle to emerge. The silent woman's presence can catalyze this crisis because her authenticity makes continued pretense feel unbearable. But she doesn't flee from this darkness or try to rescue others from it. She has traveled through similar territories herself and understands that such dissolution is necessary for psychological rebirth. Her silence during these periods isn't abandonment but the deepest form of support, creating space for transformation without trying to control or direct its course. This capacity to hold space for others' transformation without interfering represents what Jung called the transcendent function in relationship. Instead of trying to fix, analyze, or improve each other, both people can support the natural process of individuation that wants to unfold within each unique psyche. The silent woman has learned that each person's path toward wholeness is sacred and cannot be directed from the outside. Her role is to create conditions where that path can be discovered and followed rather than attempting to determine its direction or destination. This respect for others' autonomy, while remaining fully present to their process, represents a level of psychological sophistication that most people never achieve. It requires the ability to care deeply without attachment to outcomes, to love without enabling. Men without possession, to support recognize this quality as something they've never encountered before, a way of being loved that enhances rather than diminishes their own agency. They discover what it feels like to be in relationship with someone who wants them to become more fully themselves, rather than trying to shape them into someone else's vision of who they should be. This encouragement toward authenticity often unleashes creative and spiritual capacities that have been dormant for years. Men report accessing inspiration, intuition, and innovative thinking that they didn't know existed within them. The silent woman's presence seems to create conditions where these buried treasures can finally surface and express themselves. The unleashing of creative potential happens because her silence creates what artists call negative space, the emptiness that gives shape and meaning to form. In the spaciousness she creates through her conscious presence, new possibilities can emerge that would never surface in the constant chatter of ordinary social interaction. This creative emergence often feels like divine inspiration, ideas and insights that seem to come from sources beyond individual consciousness. Jung understood these experiences as contact with what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological inheritance of humanity that contains the seeds of all creative possibility. The silent woman has learned to access this collective wisdom through her own inner work, and her presence seems to open pathways for others to discover similar access within themselves. She becomes a bridge between individual consciousness and the vast creative intelligence that underlies all existence. This bridging function explains why relationships with such women often feel spiritually significant rather than merely romantic. They touch on the deepest questions of human existence and meaning, serving not just personal fulfillment, but the larger purpose of conscious evolution. Jung believed that individual transformation serves collective transformation, that as people achieve greater integration and authenticity, they contribute to the possibility for similar qualities to emerge on a cultural scale. The silent woman serves this collective function through her very existence, demonstrating possibilities that could transform how society understands relationship, communication, and human potential. Her influence extends far beyond individual relationships into the larger cultural conversation about what it means to be valuable as a woman, and what kinds of feminine energy our civilization most needs. She challenges the dominant narratives that equate worth with productivity, influence with volume, and power with external achievement. Instead, she demonstrates that the deepest influence comes from presence rather than performance, that true power emerges from inner alignment rather than external manipulation, that lasting impact comes from being rather than doing. These demonstrations create cognitive alternatives that expand the collective imagination about what kinds of relationships and ways of being are possible. The psychological sophistication of the silent woman represents what Jung called the emergence of a new type of consciousness, one that can hold paradox without needing to resolve it, that can embrace mystery without needing to explain it, that can love without needing to possess or control. This new consciousness isn't just personal development, but evolutionary development, the emergence of human capacities that could transform how our species relates to itself and to the larger web of life of which we're part. The silent woman serves as both prototype and catalyst for this evolutionary leap. Men who encounter this quality recognize it as something their souls have been seeking, even if their minds couldn't articulate what they were looking for. The attraction they feel carries this evolutionary urgency, the deep knowing that such encounters are opportunities for transformation that shouldn't be missed or taken lightly. This urgency explains why the attraction to truly silent women often feels more significant than ordinary romantic desire. It touches on what Jung called the prospective function of the psyche, the unconscious awareness of future possibilities that pulls us forward toward greater wholeness and integration. The pull toward wholeness that the silent woman represents isn't just individual, but collective, not just personal, but archetypal. She embodies qualities that our entire civilization needs to cultivate if we're to navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Her silence speaks to something that has been lost in our noise-saturated culture, something essential to human flourishing that we're only beginning to realize we've abandoned. The men who are drawn to her are responding not just to personal attraction, but to evolutionary necessity. The deep knowing that such qualities are crucial for the next phase of human development. This evolutionary dimension explains why the encounter with conscious feminine silence often feels both destined and urgent, both inevitable and precious. It represents contact with forces larger than individual choice or personal preference, archetypal currents that shape human destiny at the deepest levels. The silent woman becomes a vessel for these archetypal forces, not through passive reception, but through active cultivation of the inner conditions that allow such energies to flow through individual consciousness without distortion or manipulation. She has learned to serve something larger than her personal ego, while remaining fully present to her own unique expression of universal principles. This service to larger purposes while maintaining individual authenticity represents what Jung called the achievement of the transcendent attitude, a way of being that includes and transcends the usual dichotomies between self and other, individual and collective, personal and universal. Men recognize this transcendent quality as something they long to develop within themselves, a way of being that could give meaning and purpose to their lives beyond personal achievement or material success. The silent woman becomes both inspiration and guide for this inner development, showing through her very presence that such transformation is possible. The possibility she represents extends far beyond romantic relationship into every area of human experience. The qualities she has cultivated, depth over surface, presence over performance, being over doing, could transform how we approach work, creativity, friendship, and our relationship to life itself. This transformative potential explains why the attraction to silent women carries such psychological weight and spiritual significance. It's not just about finding a partner, but about discovering pathways to fuller human potential that have been forgotten or suppressed by contemporary culture. The recovery of these pathways represents what many depth psychologists consider the great work of our time, the reclamation of human capacities that could heal the split between inner and outer, individual and collective, human and natural, that characterizes so much modern suffering. The silent woman has begun this great work within herself, integrating opposites that most people experience as irreconcilable conflicts. Her wholeness serves as proof that such integration is possible and as invitation for others to undertake similar inner work. The invitation she extends isn't through words or persuasion, but through the irresistible attraction of authenticity itself. Men sense in her presence what they could become if they had the courage to face their own shadows, integrate their own contradictions, and discover the source of fulfillment that exists within their own consciousness. This recognition of their own potential reflected in her achievement creates what Jung called the constellation of the self, the activation of the archetype of wholeness that represents every person's deepest possibility. The silent woman becomes a catalyst for this activation, awakening dormant potentials through her very presence, rather than through any deliberate intervention. The awakening she facilitates touches the deepest levels of human consciousness, areas that remain largely unconscious in most people, but hold the keys to transformation and fulfillment that no external achievement can provide. Her silence creates conditions where these depths can finally be explored and integrated into conscious awareness. This integration of unconscious contents represents what Jung considered the primary task of human development, the process by which we become fully ourselves rather than collections of borrowed ideas, social roles, and unconscious reactions. The silent woman has advanced far along this path and serves as both model and catalyst for others who feel called to similar depths. The psychological architecture of this attraction reveals something that most people never consciously recognize but sense at the deepest levels of their being. The silent woman operates from what Jung identified as the feeling function, not in the sense of emotionality, but as a way of evaluating and responding to life that honors the deeper currents of meaning rather than surface appearances. This feeling function, when fully developed, creates what could be called value consciousness, the ability to perceive the essential worth and significance that exists beneath the obvious, the conventional, the socially approved. Men encounter this depth of perception and feel something they've been seeking without knowing they were searching for it. The experience of being valued not for what they do or achieve, but for who they are at the level of essence. Most men have learned to navigate a world where their worth is constantly measured against external metrics, where love feels conditional on performance, where acceptance depends on meeting expectations they didn't create and may not even understand. The silent woman offers something revolutionary, recognition that bypasses all these systems of evaluation and sees directly to the core of being that exists independent of accomplishment or failure. This recognition touches what Jung called the divine spark within each person, the irreducible essence that exists beyond personality, beyond role, beyond the endless adaptations we make to survive in social systems. The silent woman has learned to see this spark in herself, and that inner recognition creates the capacity to perceive it in others with startling clarity. Men experience this quality of being seen as both healing and transformative. Healing because it addresses wounds they may not even know they carry. The accumulated damage of never feeling truly witnessed in their full humanity. Transformative because it awakens possibilities within themselves they had forgotten existed, capacities that can only emerge when someone believes in their essential goodness rather than their conditional performance. This unconditional positive regard, to use Carl Rogers' term, doesn't mean the silent woman lacks discernment or accepts all behavior as equally valid. Rather, she has learned to separate essence from expression, to see the eternal within each person while maintaining clear boundaries about what kinds of interactions serve growth and what kinds diminish it. Her discernment operates from what contemplative traditions call wisdom-compassion, the ability to respond to others' highest potential while refusing to enable their lowest impulses. This balance between acceptance and accountability creates what psychologists recognize as optimal conditions for psychological growth and transformation. Men sense this balance as something they've never encountered before, a way of being loved that calls forth their best self without shaming their shadow aspects. They discover what it feels like to be in relationship with someone who can hold space for their entire psychological spectrum without being overwhelmed by its intensity or complexity. This capacity to hold psychological complexity without being destabilized by it emerges from what Jung called the container function of mature consciousness. The silent woman has developed sufficient inner stability to remain centered, while others process difficult emotions, face uncomfortable truths, or navigate periods of confusion and uncertainty. Her stability doesn't come from rigidity or emotional numbness, but from what could be called flexible strength, the ability to bend without breaking, to remain present without being reactive, to care deeply without being consumed by others' psychological weather patterns. This flexible strength creates what systems theorists call a secure base, a psychological safe haven where others can explore aspects of themselves they've never felt safe enough to examine. In her presence, men often discover they have access to vulnerability they thought would destroy them, to creativity they didn't know existed, to emotional depths they were taught to fear. The emergence of these buried aspects of personality often feels like awakening from a long sleep, like coming alive after years of existing in a kind of psychological hibernation. Colors seem more vivid, experiences more meaningful, life more worth living. This isn't romantic idealization, but the natural result of accessing fuller ranges of human capacity that have been dormant sometimes for decades. The silent woman serves as witness to this awakening without trying to direct or control its unfolding. She understands that each person's journey toward wholeness follows its own unique trajectory and cannot be forced or managed from the outside. Her role is to maintain the quality of presence that allows natural healing and growth to occur, rather than trying to determine its pace or direction. This trust in natural processes reflects what Taoists call alignment with the Tao, the underlying intelligence that governs all natural development. The silent woman has learned to cooperate with these deeper currents rather than swimming against them, creating effortless effectiveness that emerges from harmony with natural law rather than force of will. Men experience this alignment as something approaching magic, the sense of being in relationship with someone who operates from principles that transcend ordinary social dynamics. Her responses emerge from sources deeper than personality or strategy, carrying the authority of natural law rather than personal preference or cultural conditioning. This authority doesn't manifest as dominance or control, but as what could be called presence authority, influence that emerges from depth of being rather than force of will. She doesn't need to argue her points because they carry the weight of lived truth. She doesn't need to defend her boundaries because they emerge from such inner clarity that others naturally respect them. Men recognize this quality of inner authority as something they long to develop within themselves, a way of being in the world that doesn't depend on external validation or aggressive assertion of will. In her presence, they glimpse the possibility of power that emerges from alignment rather than opposition, strength that comes from integration rather than domination. This glimpse of alternative ways of being powerful often triggers what depth psychologists call the sacred wound, the painful recognition of how far they've strayed from their own authentic nature in pursuit of socially approved forms of masculine identity. The silent woman's presence reveals the cost of this adaptation without judgment or demand for immediate change. Her non-judgmental witness of their recognition creates space for what Jung called the transcendent function to operate, the psychological mechanism that bridges conscious understanding and unconscious transformation. Men often report that insights gained in her presence seem to integrate automatically into their behavior and decision-making, without the usual struggle of trying to force change through willpower alone. This effortless integration happens because her silence creates what could be called metabolic space, psychological room for new understanding to be digested and assimilated at deep levels. Unlike the constant stimulation of most social interaction, her presence allows the psyche's natural processing mechanisms to operate without interference. The psychological digestion that occurs in this space often reveals patterns and connections that were invisible in the noise of ordinary consciousness. Men discover relationships between childhood experiences and adult behavior, connections between suppressed emotions and physical symptoms, links between unfulfilled creative impulses and career dissatisfaction. These discoveries don't come through analysis or interpretation, but through what phenomenologists call direct seeing, immediate perception that bypasses the filtering mechanisms of rational thought. The silent woman's presence seems to create conditions where this kind of direct perception becomes natural and accessible. The access to direct perception often feels like developing a new sense organ, a capacity for knowing that operates independent of logical reasoning or emotional reaction. Men report making decisions from this deeper knowing that feel absolutely right, even when they can't rationally justify them, choices that lead to outcomes they never could have planned, but somehow feel inevitable. This access to intuitive guidance represents what Jung called the transcendent function in practical application, the ability to receive information from sources beyond personal consciousness and translate it into effective action in the world. The silent woman has developed this capacity within herself, and her presence tends to activate similar potentials in others. The activation of intuitive capacities often accompanies what mystics call the opening of the heart, not as emotional sentimentality, but as expansion of consciousness that allows perception of subtler dimensions of reality. Men often report seeing beauty they never noticed before, feeling connected to nature in new ways, experiencing spontaneous gratitude for ordinary moments. These shifts in perception represent what contemplative traditions recognize as the beginning stages of awakening, the gradual recognition that reality contains dimensions of meaning and connection that remain invisible to ordinary consciousness. The silent woman serves as guide to these territories, not through teaching, but through modeling what it looks like to live from expanded awareness. Her modeling demonstrates that such expanded awareness doesn't require withdrawal from ordinary life, but transforms how ordinary life is experienced and engaged. She shows that it's possible to be fully present to mundane activities while remaining connected to sources of meaning that give significance to the smallest gestures and interactions. This integration of sacred and ordinary represents what Jung called the achievement of the transcendent attitude, a way of being that finds the eternal within the temporal, the infinite within the finite, the divine within the human. Men recognize this integration as something they've been unconsciously seeking, a way of living that gives meaning to existence beyond material achievement or social recognition. The meaning she embodies isn't abstract philosophy, but lived reality, demonstrated through the quality of attention she brings to whatever she's doing, the presence she maintains in whatever circumstances arise, the depth she accesses in the simplest interactions. This embodied spirituality appeals to men who have grown weary of religious concepts that remain disconnected from daily experience, philosophical ideas that don't translate into practical wisdom, spiritual practices that create division between sacred and secular, rather than revealing their fundamental unity. The silent woman offers something different: spirituality that emerges from depth of being rather than adherence to beliefs, wisdom that manifests in how she lives rather than what she says, sacred presence that transforms ordinary moments rather than requiring special conditions or practices. Men sense this integration as something that could heal the splits they experience between work and meaning, relationship and growth, success and fulfillment. In her presence, they glimpse the possibility of living from wholeness rather than fragmentation, of finding the sacred within whatever circumstances they encounter rather than seeking it in distant goals or idealized futures. This vision of integrated living often catalyzes what Jung called the individuation imperative, the inner call to become fully oneself rather than remaining trapped in partial expressions of human potential. The silent woman serves as herald of this call, demonstrating through her very existence that such wholeness is possible and worth whatever it costs to achieve. The cost she has paid is visible in the quality of her presence, the depth that can only come from having faced and integrated the shadow aspects of personality that most people spend their lives avoiding. She carries the scars of her journey toward wholeness, but they have become sources of strength rather than weakness, wisdom rather than bitterness. Men recognize these scars as marks of authenticity rather than damage, evidence of someone who has lived fully rather than safely, who has chosen growth over comfort, depth over surface appeal. The beauty they perceive in her emerges not from perfection, but from integration, not from avoiding difficulty, but from transforming it into wisdom. This transformed relationship to difficulty creates what could be called anti-fragile consciousness, the capacity to grow stronger through challenges rather than being diminished by them. The silent woman demonstrates that it's possible to meet life's inevitable difficulties with grace rather than resistance, to find meaning in suffering rather than being defeated by it. Men long for this kind of resilience because they recognize how much energy they spend avoiding discomfort, resisting change, protecting themselves from experiences that might actually serve their growth. The silent woman shows them another way, a path that leads through difficulty rather than around it, finding treasure in the depths that most people fear to explore. Her courage in facing inner darkness gives men permission to explore their own shadow territories, the aspects of themselves they've been taught to reject or suppress. In her presence, they often discover that what they feared most about themselves contains the very qualities they need for wholeness and authentic expression. This shadow integration doesn't happen through forced confrontation, but through what Jung called active imagination, the capacity to engage with unconscious contents through imagery, dialogue, and creative expression. The silent woman's presence creates conditions where such engagement feels safe and natural, rather than threatening or overwhelming. The safety she provides emerges not from protecting others from difficulty, but from demonstrating that all psychological material can be metabolized and integrated when approached with sufficient consciousness and compassion. Her silence often carries this quality of compassionate witness, presence that doesn't judge or try to fix, but simply holds space for whatever needs to emerge. This quality of holding space represents what many consider the highest form of love, presence that allows others to be fully themselves without trying to change or improve them. Men experience this unconditional acceptance as something they've been seeking their entire lives, often without realizing that such love was possible. The experience of being loved without conditions often triggers what psychologists call earned security, the development of secure attachment patterns even in people who didn't experience them in childhood. The silent woman's consistent, non-reactive presence creates new neural pathways that allow for healthier relationship patterns to emerge and stabilize. These new patterns don't just affect romantic relationships, but extend into all areas of life. transforming how men relate to work, creativity, friendship, and their understanding of what it means to live with purpose and meaning. The integration that occurs in her presence ripples outward, affecting every aspect of existence. The ripple effects often surprise men with their scope and depth. They find themselves making different choices about how to spend their time, what kinds of work feel meaningful, which relationships deserve their energy and attention. These changes don't feel forced, but emerge naturally from the expanded awareness that develops in her presence. The expanded awareness reveals possibilities that were always present but invisible to ordinary consciousness, options and opportunities that become apparent when someone is no longer trapped in reactive patterns and defensive adaptations. The silent woman's influence helps men see their lives from new perspectives that reveal potential they never knew existed. This revelation of hidden potential often feels like discovering treasure that was buried in their own backyard, riches they could have accessed at any time if they had known where to look. The silent woman serves as guide to this inner treasure, not through maps or instructions, but through the quality of attention she brings to whatever arises. Her attention reveals the sacred dimension that exists within ordinary experience, the extraordinary that hides within the mundane, the infinite that expresses itself through finite forms. Men learn to see through her eyes, developing the capacity to perceive depths and meanings that transform their relationship to existence itself. This transformation of perception represents what many spiritual traditions consider the ultimate goal of human development, the recognition that reality is far richer and more meaningful than ordinary consciousness can perceive. The silent woman has achieved this recognition, and her presence serves as catalyst for similar awakening in others. The awakening she facilitates doesn't require dramatic experiences or altered states, but emerges through the gradual development of what could be called contemplative consciousness, awareness that can perceive the subtle dimensions of meaning that permeate every moment of existence. Men develop this contemplative capacity in her presence not through practice or technique, but through what could be called contagious consciousness, the natural transmission of awareness that occurs when someone who has achieved depth shares space with others who are ready to receive what she has to offer. This transmission happens below the level of conscious intention, through what Jung called participation mystique, the unconscious sharing of psychological contents that occurs when people achieve genuine intimacy. The silent woman shares her depth not through teaching, but through being, not through explanation, but through demonstration. The demonstration she provides reveals possibilities that could transform not just individual lives, but collective culture, showing what becomes possible when human consciousness develops beyond the fragmented, reactive patterns that characterize most contemporary existence. Her influence extends far beyond personal relationships, into the larger conversation about what kinds of consciousness our civilization most needs to cultivate if we're to navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. She represents evolutionary potential that exists within every human being, but remains largely dormant in most people. The dormant potential she awakens includes capacities for wisdom, compassion, creativity, and spiritual discernment that could address the deepest problems facing humanity. Men who encounter these capacities in her presence often feel called to develop similar qualities within themselves, not for personal benefit, but for service to something larger than individual fulfillment. This call to service represents what Jung considered the highest expression of individuation, the recognition that personal wholeness serves collective transformation, that individual awakening contributes to the evolution of consciousness itself. The silent woman embodies this evolutionary principle, demonstrating that the deepest personal work ultimately serves transpersonal purposes, that becoming fully oneself is not selfish but profoundly generous, contributing to the collective possibility for similar awakening to emerge on a larger scale. Men sense this larger significance in their attraction to her, recognizing that what draws them transcends personal desire and touches on evolutionary necessity. The deep knowing that such consciousness is crucial for the next phase of human development. The recognition of evolutionary significance in this attraction reveals something profound about the masculine psyche's relationship to its own development. When a man encounters a woman who embodies conscious silence, he's not just experiencing romantic desire, but touching what Jung called the collective imperative, the unconscious drive toward greater wholeness that exists within the species itself. This collective dimension explains why such encounters often feel larger than personal choice, carrying the weight of destiny or fate. The attraction operates at frequencies deeper than individual preference, tapping into archetypal currents that have shaped human consciousness throughout history. The silent woman represents something that has always existed as potential within human nature, but rarely manifests in its full expression. Her rarity makes the encounter feel precious beyond ordinary relationship dynamics. Men sense they're in the presence of something that shouldn't be wasted or taken lightly, an opportunity for transformation that may not come again. This recognition creates what could be called sacred urgency, the deep knowing that such meetings serve purposes larger than personal gratification. The sacred dimension of this attraction emerges because the silent woman has learned to embody what mystics call the eternal feminine, not as gender stereotype but as archetypal principle that represents the receptive, intuitive, and generative aspects of consciousness itself. Her silence creates space for the eternal to manifest within temporal experience. Men recognize this eternal quality as something they've been seeking without knowing how to name it. They sense in her presence contact with dimensions of reality that exist beyond the mundane concerns that dominate everyday consciousness. Her silence becomes a doorway to experiences of meaning and connection that feel both ancient and immediate. This connection to eternal principles transforms the quality of interaction from social exchange to something approaching communion. In her presence, men often report feeling connected not just to her, but to larger patterns of meaning that give significance to existence beyond personal achievement or material success. The communion that emerges in these spaces isn't mystical experience in the dramatic sense, but quiet recognition of the sacred that exists within ordinary moments. Her presence reveals the temple that exists wherever conscious beings meet, in authentic recognition of their shared essence. The silent woman exists as both mirror and mystery, reflecting back to men the depths they've forgotten and the wholeness they've abandoned in their rush toward external validation. She stands as living proof that true power emerges not from noise, but from presence, not from performance, but from being, not from filling every space with words, but from creating sacred emptiness where truth can finally breathe. In a world that has forgotten the art of listening to itself, she becomes the keeper of silence that heals, the guardian of depths that transform, the embodiment of everything our fragmented culture desperately needs to remember about what it means to be fully human.